Thank you. Wonderful to be here. You must be exhausted, or at least saturated by now. I thought you would not see enough pictures of 3D printers today. So I added sort of our own, well, it's not our own, but it's a food printer, a bioprinter. And bioprinters are somewhat special because they have to work with delicate materials. And when you look at these printers, when I look at these printers, I ask two questions. First, why? And second is, what should I put in those printers to print? What is the material that you're going to print in it? The why is kind of interesting, though. This is from T&O in Eindhoven, and they designed the printer. It's really a 3D printing designer kind of facility, but they also venture into food. And the first thing that they did was they imagined this. They cooked a carrot, they crushed it, made a paste out of it, and then they printed a carrot. And these are really smart, sensible people. So you ask the question, why on earth are you doing something like that? And they said, well, there is a group of patients that cannot swallow and cannot chew. And they are reliant on these liquid materials. And if you have ever tried that for years in a row, you really get tired of it, right? So what we want to do is to create the same experience. And by then, I already had realized that food is emotion. It's not only like nutrition, it's a lot of other things, also visual, also having the idea that you belong to society. And so now people can eat a carrot without worrying about the consistency. So you can make it any type of consistency. So even if you don't swallow or you don't chew, you can still eat a carrot and you don't have to drink it. Because drinking carrots, well, I guess you can, but it's not a great experience. But that's the 3D printing. I will come back to the 3D printing a little bit later. Food is a complex problem, and it's increasingly going to be a complex problem because we are going to 10 billion people, and it's not only 10 billion people, it's also people with more sophisticated needs, more high-quality foods, choices, but also high-quality proteins. As we get richer and wealthier, we want the high-quality proteins. And that's a very expensive part of our diet. Expensive, not in terms of money, well also, but mostly in terms of resources. We spend a lot of resources in creating these type of tissues. So why would you want to change that? What kind of technologies do you want to create to replace food, to manufacture food? We grow food. That's what we have been doing for thousands and thousands of years. It's a very efficient system. I will take you back to high school biology. This is the chemical reaction that describes photosynthesis. So plants have evolved into doing something remarkable. They take CO2 out of the air, they take a little bit of water out of the soil, and through the action of sunlight, they actually create a molecule called glucose. And glucose is a very simple molecule, but it actually, with a couple of other components, again, out of the soil, make all the materials that we consist of. Proteins, sugars, fatty acids, everything that we need comes from this type of source. And the remarkable thing is, so you probably also know this from biology, there's one little piece in the plant that does this. It's called the chloroplast, and it absorbs this sunlight, and it has all the machinery to make out of CO2 and water glucose. And the chloroplast is something that originally was not in the plant. It's like a virus, like a parasite. And eventually it invaded the plant, and it became this wonderful organism, very efficient for food production. So why would you change that? CO2 out of the air, it's a CO2 sink, and a very efficient, it uses sunlight, energy that's freely available. So why would you change that? A couple of years ago, in the press, there was a big announcement of investigators in Norway who started to make amino acids, the building blocks of our proteins, just from nitrogen from the air, oxygen from the air, water, and putting a lot of energy in it. So it takes a lot of energy to recreate what plants are already by themselves are doing. However, if at some point energy becomes abundant, then maybe this is another way of producing amino acids, or at least some of those building blocks. Still, it's not a very good business case, but in theory, it can be done. Another staple of our agriculture and our food is our animals. This is a cow, 2 cows actually. Well, it's actually a bull. But if I look at this, I see essentially a technology that converts plant proteins into animal proteins. And it's an old technology, right? And it's actually a very inefficient technology. If you today would design a system to make animal proteins out of plant proteins, you would never come up with a cow. It's very, very inefficient. Only 15% of everything that you put in, you get out as meat. So we have, on the one hand, the plants, very efficient. We can replace it, but maybe not a very good reason why you should do that. And on the other hand, the animals. And there are actually many good reasons to get rid of those animals. One is that the system is not open. It's not like a closed cycle of nitrogen, carbon, and phosphorus. It's an open system. Cows pee goes into the pasture, goes into the river, goes into the ocean. Lost, right? The other is that it consumes a lot of water. I mentioned it's a very resource-intense piece of our diet. Also, and I don't know how the discussion here is in Thailand, but in the Netherlands it's very, very fiercely held. Livestock is responsible for 15 to 20% of all greenhouse gas emission. So the policy debates in the Netherlands about climate change, in one line in newspapers, it's carbon burning power plants, transportation, and meat eating. Those are the three in one sort of sentence that define where we should aim our policies at to reduce climate change. And finally, there is loss of biodiversity. And that has been described very recently again in the news. A much bigger loss of biodiversity than we actually had anticipated, and we don't know what the consequences of that will be. We just don't know. And for sure, that is not all attributed to modern agriculture, but part of it definitely is, although the evidence for that is sort of hard to come by. Also, there are places, even on this planet, but definitely if we start to move into space, where you cannot actually use traditional agriculture to grow food. So you have to come up with different paradigms anyway. So let's get back to that meat, that most precious part of our diet. Can we change that? Can we make that in a different way? And in 1932, Churchill mentions in his book, Thoughts and Adventures, that at some point we would see the absurdity of growing an entire chicken if you only eat the breast and the legs. And we would grow tissue under a suitable sort of fluid medium. And of course, he was a statesman. He had no idea what he was talking about. But he was a friend of Alexis Carrel, Nobel Prize-winning physiologist, who at that time, in the 30s, could for the first time keep organs alive outside of the body. So it's in essence a medical technology. And they saw that these organs grew a little bit, and they kind of started to imagine, oh, maybe we can use this for food at some point. However, in 1932, the technology was not there yet. It kind of had to wait for the discovery, if you like, of stem cells. Stem cells are wonderful things. Our body is full of them. We have embryonic stem cells that can make any tissue, can make an entire organism, can make a human being or a cow. But we also have tissue-specific stem cells. They're sitting in our tissues, waiting for them to be injured or less functional, and they replace tissue by new tissue. And our muscle is full of them. So if you tear a muscle, stem cells come in, they divide, and they make the muscle tissue again, functional muscle tissue. It's a wonderful system. Not scar tissue, functional muscle tissue. So the idea is very, very simple. You poke a cow in the butt, get a small sliver of muscle out of it, let's say 1 centimeter long, 1 millimeter in diameter, has a couple of hundred of these stem cells in it, and then you let the stem cells outside of the body do what they're good at, dividing, proliferating. So this is my contribution to the exponential process. Actually, it's the cell's contribution to the exponential process. So 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 16, and so forth. And so we let them divide, and from a very small piece of muscle, we can create thousands of kilos of meat. What in effect does that is that it reduces the amount of cows that we need from, let's say, 1.5 billion on this planet, which we really have, to a couple of hundred maybe, or let's say 30,000 to keep the herd genetically stable. And that would reduce the resources that we need to feed those cows that they lose, that they waste more or less, and also reduce the greenhouse gas emission, and of course also reduces the amount of animals that we actually need to kill for our own purpose. That's fine, you can grow these cells. Cells don't really taste very well. They don't have the structure of meat. They don't have the nutritional value of meat. So how do you make meat from those cells? Well, that's actually relatively easy. So first, they need to merge into a muscle fiber. And you saw that merged muscle fiber. It's a very simple instruction. Once they start dividing and you get lots of cells, you basically starve them. And once you start starving them, they start to merge into these primitive muscle fibers. And then they need to perform labor, because we all know that muscles need to move and perform labor to bulk up, to create enough protein for contraction. And it's interesting, you probably have never thought about that, but if you run marathons, you don't get thick muscles, right? You have to actually pump weights. You have to go to the gym and, against the resistance, let your muscles perform labor. And it's exactly the same in a, let's say, a Petri dish. So what we do is we place the merged fibers in a ring structure around a central column. And again, something magical happens. These cells kind of find each other. They attach to each other. They form a tissue. They do that all by themselves. We don't have to do anything, actually. And then they start to contract. Our muscle cells are exercise junkies. Our brains are not, but these are not connected to a brain. So they just start to contract. And because they are in this ring, that develops tension, and that allows them to produce more protein and get sort of thick Schwarzenegger muscles. All right, so what we did was actually very, very simple. It was already referred to in 2013. We made the first hamburger from stem cells, and we basically used this process. So first, create a lot of cells, then let the cells make these tissues. So we made 10,000 of these muscle fibers, put them together in a patty, made a hamburger out of this, in other words, and presented that in London, sort of in a hybrid between a cooking show and a press conference where people got to cook it and to eat it. That hamburger cost us about €250,000 to produce. So it was not particularly cheap. But actually it was our mission in that time to show to the world, guys, this can be done. This is a technology that's out there. And by the way, we need to think how we are going to produce meat in the future, because what we're currently doing is not sustainable. With the increasing demand for meat in the next 35 years, 70% increase compared to now, we're just not going to cut that. So we need to think about other ways. That was fine, very expensive, proof of concept. Of course, since then, we have been working on this to make it scalable, to make it cheap, well, cheaper, not cheap, but cheaper. Right now it would be like 10 euro for a hamburger like this, still expensive, but much cheaper. And to remove all kind of the things that were still in there that we wanted to get rid of to make it a really good product. It's not, if you're going to ask me, when it's going to the market, not yet. It's going to take another 2-3 years because it also has to go through regulatory approval, right? This is in Europe a novel food. That means that you have to prove that it is safe. And of course, we want to prove that it is safe, and we believe that it is safe. So up till 3 years ago, I was the only one in the world doing this. And after a couple of years, it feels like awkward. Am I stupid, or is nobody else getting this? And I'm very, very happy that in the last 2.5 years, we got actually a lot of competitors. Now, this is a very busy slide, and we didn't get that many competitors. Some of these are investors or working in plant-based space. But others are, we now have about 35 companies working on similar technologies, either for beef, fish, chicken, or pork. Because you can do this with every creature that has stem cells in their muscle, right? And there are different reasons to do pigs or chicken or fish, different than for cow. For instance, all those animals are more efficient than a cow. So efficiency is not the biggest reason, but for fish, for instance, it's biodiversity mostly. And for chicken, it's primarily animal welfare because there are a lot of animals going through that process. But the fact is that these all are there now, these companies. They're getting funding from major meat industry, from venture capitalists, and it's still not really big, but it's getting there. A lot more people than 2.5 years ago are getting into this space. And it's actually also worldwide. The hotspots are California, Israel, and the Netherlands, but actually in a large number of other countries, people are starting to build companies around this idea. So once you have gotten your head around this, why stick to stuff that we already know, right? One word of warning, this is no GMO, not genetic modification. It kind of looks like it, but it's not. So I'm usually a little bit hesitant to show this slide, but I thought, let's be kind of festive. So it's just mixing stem cells from different species, right, and make new products, new creations. And of course, you can do that. What's a little bit more interesting, at least for me, is that you can make this muscle or this hamburger healthier. So currently, one of the issues with the London hamburger was it did not have any fat. So the people said, well, €250,000, it's still a little bit dry. Let's work on this a little bit. So we're currently making fat tissue. Again, this is a medical technology. In the medical field, there's not a lot of reasons to make fat tissue. So we kind of had to redesign that. But we are now making fat tissue, and at some point, we just combine the muscle tissue with the fat tissue and make it into a hamburger. The trick is that these cells, these bovine, these cow fat cells, are perfectly capable of making omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids. They're perfectly capable of doing that, yet they typically don't in the cow. So we can find instructions to give to those fat cells to start making those omega-3 fatty acids and then make a hamburger that's actually healthier for you, that reduces your cholesterol instead of increasing your cholesterol. So I think this is a little bit more relevant kind of way to go than into the fantastic animals. Now, this is a part of the story that I usually also don't tell because it's really out there, and I'm trying to stretch your imagination to the extreme. And this is, can we make green muscles? Right? I told you that this chloroplast is actually originally a parasite that invaded the plant cell to use sunlight and oxygen or CO2 and water to create glucose, to create its own energy source. Can we do something similar with muscle tissue. And you know what? It has been done. Muscle cells have been kind of injected with chloroplasts so that they become green muscles, right? It's a little bit awkward. It's like, I don't know whether you know the story of Dr. Seuss, green eggs and ham. Well, this is green ham. But you can actually create muscle cells that generate their own energy. You have to have sunlight, but you can do that. This is really out there. This would really fall under GMO, I guess. Although, technically it may not be. So there are lots of possibilities. Fine for hamburgers. Here is my other 3D printing. This is completely unrealistic, by the way, as a printing system. It's just to give an image of what we need to think about in the end, because hamburgers are fine. It's 50% of the market, at least minced meat is 50% of the market. But it is, in a way, a byproduct of steaks. So can we make a ribeye? Right? And we can. Not now, but eventually we can. And this is where 3D printing or any other free-form fabrication method comes in. So there are 3 additional conditions if you want to move from a hamburger to a ribeye. One is you need to impose a larger 3D structure on those cells. Remember, they were kind of in that ring structure, they kind of self-organized, and there's a limit to that. So if you want to create something like this, you need to impose a larger 3D structure. So combination of a firm biomaterial that can hold on to this structure and the cells, and a 3D printing method to get them in place. Second, you see here that muscle cells and fat cells are kind of growing together, as they, of course, in our body are as well, right? So they're growing together. And you need to find the conditions where they can actually grow together. Not a big deal. In our body, they do the same thing, so you will be able to do that, but it requires some additional work. And actually, it might have benefits, because usually those cells affect each other in a beneficial way. And the third is that we need to create a channel and perfusion system to get oxygen and nutrients delivered through every piece of the tissue. That's why you and I have blood vessels, right? To do that. That's the function of it. Now, here we don't have blood, so we don't necessarily need blood vessels, but we need to create some sort of channel system and perfusion system to do that. This is all medical technology. For organs, we have exactly the same challenge, and a lot of people are working on this. So eventually this will happen. And there's actually a company that yesterday got 12 million dollars in Series A funding, ALEF, to exactly do this, to start with making 3D whole thickness pieces of muscle. So that's the muscle part. That's still focusing kind of on meat. We don't need animal proteins. You all grew up. Who, by the way, of you is vegetarian? Really? Okay. 1, okay. 2. Oh, gradually they start to confess. 3. Vegan, anybody? No, okay. If I ask this question in Berlin, or in Zurich, or in London, in colleges where the average age is below 25, 25% of the people raise their hands. And then they ask me, now you should ask who is vegan, and another 10% raise their hands. It's really, there are pockets in this world where that percentage is rapidly increasing. And they're showing us, and with that also the 2 billion involuntarily vegetarians that are on this planet, that you don't need really animal proteins. We grew up with that, but it's a myth. So we can kind of find substitute for it. If you're vegan, you have to be careful. You have to know what you're doing. But just vegetarian, fine, right? And it would be a good idea to all become vegetarian. Maybe not the most appealing idea, but it would be a good idea from a planet perspective and a resource perspective. So, of course, lots of people are working on alternative proteins. from microorganisms, microproteins, algae being industrially produced right now. Microproteins is just a brand that you can buy mostly in Britain, corn. But also algae, very protein rich. So these are all novel sources of proteins that could produce material that you eventually in a 3D printer can make it look like a carrot, for instance. Or insect proteins. You may not really like them, but if they're in a powder, if it's really only the protein, and again, you kind of print it into whatever kind of shape or form without any reference to the animal with 6 legs and a couple of wings, it may be fine. So we have other resources to go into. And also on the plant-based proteins, a lot of things are happening. So plant-based proteins, meat substitutes, were typically something for vegetarians and vegans. For a very small market, they were marketed for that particular population. So it really hasn't taken off, although it has been in existence for about 50 years. But right now, they are going to market it for meat eaters. This is the Impossible Burger. You probably have heard of it. It's basically a plant-based burger, but what they did, they inserted a blood protein in it so that it becomes red, and it actually looks as if it's bleeding. And they also think that this actually adds to the taste of the hamburger. But they also market it for meat eaters. They have kind of pushed, not only this, but also other ones, pushed the supermarkets to put it in the meat section and not in the sort of diet section somewhere in a corner of the shop. So this is going to happen, this is going to increase. Now, you may think, and a lot of people, when we presented this thing in London, everybody said, yuck, is this really what we should be doing? And I was kind of frustrated by that because it's an emotion, and I didn't quite understood where that emotion came from. And one of the dilemmas was this is a hot dog. And I'm sure some of you have eaten this hot dog. I couldn't find sort of the Thai sort of correlate of a hot dog. But this is something that is very popular. Nobody knows what's in it. Nobody knows how it's being produced. So it's not dissimilar from our hamburger, right? And still, people eat it. We are perfectly capable of eating stuff that we don't know how it's being made or what it's made of, right? So how is that, how do you transition from, this is, by the way, well, no, we'll get back to that later. Why then not my hamburger? And this is about safety. You see your neighbor eating a hot dog and he stays alive, right? And so you develop trust that this is a safe product, that you can eat this. It takes time, it takes people who try this and eat it. And then gradually that trust will come into that product. And that's exactly what needs to happen with cultured meat. So if you think that this is never going to be accepted, just wait a little bit, and I'm sure it will. The other thing is, can you start thinking how you can make this a little bit less sort of fantastic or less kind of out there, out of control? So we typically want to have the illusion of control over how our food is being produced, right? It's also a matter of trust, by the way. And so if you, and this is kind of not dissimilar from other technologies, if we get introduced to a new technology, we immediately start to think, can this be abused somehow? Right? It's a weird kind of thought that we have. Can this be abused somehow? I get that question a lot. How is it going to change society? Is there any sort of undesirable societal effects of this? And so we said, well, wait a minute, you can do this. This is not really related to the technology. This is how it's going to be implemented in society. So what if you can make this in a very local system, like in a microbrewery? I understand microbreweries are illegal in Thailand, but they're still there. So you can think of the scheme. You can grow it in a very small community, local production. You can visit it on Sundays so that you have full control over how your meat is being made. You can order it there. And so it kind of illustrates that you have to kind of dissociate this technology and the thoughts you have on how it's going to be implemented in society, because it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. So my vision for the future is actually very, very conservative, almost going back. You know, food for us is important. It's not only nutrition, it's a big societal context. It's getting together, it's interacting, it's a variety, it's choice, it's enrichment, it's health. And so what we want to do is to keep all that variety, keep that social interaction, keep those pieces of human behavior, but not have the negative impact on our planet. And that's what we're trying to do with coming up with manufacturing solutions for parts of our food system that are not sustainable. Thank you very much.